The job was too good to be true. I understand that now. The message had popped up in my inbox like 1,000 before it. It sat nestled between a buy Viagra online and a congratulations, you've just win a free iPad email. But as I hovered my mouse over it, I found myself intrigued by the tagline. I could usually spot spam messages, even the ones my inbox seems incapable of catching. This one, though, something about it caught my eye. The spelling and grammar were on point, and something about it just screamed attention. I moved my cursor over the box and hovered it over the email. Preparing to break the cardinal rule, I read the title one more time. Mazer Inc. seeking subjects for free at-home testing. I clicked it, and a very official-looking email informed me that I had been randomly selected to take part in a clinical trial. The email detailed the parameters for this test, the time frame for the test, and the payment method for completion of the test. The parameters were basically A. Take the required supplement they sent you with breakfast and dinner. B. Sign on and watch a series of videos every day for 2 hours. They would involve color patterns, pictographs, and several other standard mental tests. And C. You wear the required Mazer Inc. monitor device while I slept so they could monitor my brain activity and the effects of the supplement. For the price they were quoting, it sounded like a great job. I'd have been a fool not to look into it. I looked the company up online first. It's pretty easy to see which companies are scams these days and which are legit. Mazer Inc. was a publicly traded company, and they did a lot of business in pharmaceuticals and healthcare. They had a few squibs in the news about questionable business practices, but who didn't these days? At the end of the day, they looked on the level, so I applied to their email, thinking I'd never hear back from them again. The return email came a few hours later, thanking me for agreeing to the trial and saying they would ship out my initial package and my initial payment the same day. 3 days later, there was a brown cardboard box on my front doorstep from Mazer Inc., the logo stamped prominently across the side of the box. I hadn't expected it so soon, but the extra money was a nice bonus. Most of my work has been from home these days, and the little bit of it that I was getting was barely keeping the lights on and the rent paid. COVID was still making working in an office difficult, and in these troubled times, every little bit helped. I opened the box and found 8 bottles of something called NeuroBoost. They came in standard 120 capsule bottles and looked perfectly normal, just like something you'd buy at CVS. The monitor turned out to be something similar to an Apple Watch. It had a shiny black band and a smart little face that displayed heart rate, blood pressure, and other general health statistics. I slipped it on, but was confused when I didn't see anywhere to charge it. I shrugged, figuring maybe the internal batteries would last a while. There was also a check stapled to a set of instructions telling me how to get onto the Mazer Inc. website so that I could take my daily mandatory testing. For the amount they were paying, it seemed like a pretty sweet deal if all I had to do was watch a few videos and take some pills and watch the movies for 2 hours a day. When I got up the next morning, there was a bright display on the front of the watch reminding me to take my pills and do my training. So I got up and made some breakfast, took my pills, and got ready for my day. The pills were oily and gave me some fairly rancid burps, but they weren't too bad. When the watch reminded me at noon that I needed to take my training for the day, I sat down at my computer and got to it. The videos were mostly a series of color patterns, flashing in quick succession, as well as a series of brain games that had me doing math or solving puzzles. I guess the pills were supposed to boost my cognitive functions, and I wanted to see if it had affected my scores on the games as badly as the text did. If it did, I couldn't tell. And after my mandatory 2 hours, I closed it up and opened my work folder to see if there was anything new from the office. For the next couple of weeks, everything was fine. I took my pills twice a day, did my mandatory testing, and wore my armband religiously. I found that I liked having it on after a while. It was very comfortable, and being able to glance down and look at my vitals was kind of nice. I've never really had the money for fancy tech, so having something that sort of looked like fancy tech was nice. At the time, I would have told you everything was fine for about the first 2 weeks. But after a few days, I began to notice some strange things around my apartment. It was subtle stuff at first. Things moved, items missing that reappeared a few days later, but it was something more subtle than that as well. Sometimes it felt like someone else had been in my apartment. But that was crazy. The chain was always on, the door was always locked, and, at least to my knowledge, I was the only one that had been in my house since about a week before the quarantine. I thought at the time that I was just being neurotic. But now that I look back on it, I'm pretty sure there was more to it than I was picking up on. The first real sign came to me while I was watching the color patterns one day. I'd been taking the pills for about 2 weeks when one day I watched the colors go from quick flashes of green and blue and yellow and saw a picture. It was just for a second, nothing really substantial, but it looked like a street. It wasn't a street that I knew, and it looked as though it had been torn up by something. I didn't get a good look at it. It was only a flash for a second, but I had to double take to see if I had actually seen what I'd seen. I kept a closer eye on them from then on, but I didn't see anything else that day. The program moved on to math problems a few seconds later, but I never quite forgot about that picture for the rest of the day. That's probably why I remembered it later. I was scrolling through Facebook later, just getting ready to drop off, kind of checking it over without really reading anything, when a friend's post jumped out at me. He was ex-military and he was talking about an attack in Kabul that day, talking about how the military needed to do more or something, when the same street appeared in his picture. It had been the site of a bombing, and the street was destroyed, just as I'd seen it earlier. I sat dry-mouthed for a minute, just mulling it over in my head. The longer I did, the more I kind of began to make excuses for it. It was very strange, but I eventually chalked it up to similarities. I hadn't actually seen that particular street. I was just seeing it now and associating it with what I'd seen earlier. There was no way I had seen the site of an attack before it had even happened. It just wasn't the sort of thing that normal people did. I turned my phone off and rolled over, going to sleep as I told myself it had never come up again. The next day, however, I woke up and found that my shoes were missing. It wasn't like they were expensive or anything, just a pair of Walmart New Balances, but it was the fact that they were missing that confused me. I'd set them beside the door 4 days ago when I'd last left the house. There was no reason in the world that they should be gone, but they were. I could still see the mud from the running track on the carpet by the door, the only proof that they'd been there at all. I searched the house, thinking maybe I'd just put them down somewhere and forgotten about it, but they were nowhere to be found. That made me worried, but again, I put it out of my mind. I was just going stir-crazy from the quarantine, that was all. I just needed to get out more. I'd been taking the pills for about a month when I started seeing more pictures. It happened suddenly. One minute I was seeing red and yellow and blue and purple go by, and the next second they were solidifying into pictures. A Walmart somewhere, a Jeep out in the desert, a shoe left on a beach, a bunch of sunflowers, on and on and on. The colors were gone. I never saw them again. From then on, it was just random pictures. I called the number on the back of the bottle after reading it over to see if there were any side effects. After finding the helpline, the one that says to call if you have any adverse reactions, I waited for the robot call to cease and for a person to pick up. To my surprise, someone picked up right away, and I was spared the indignity of wading through the muck. The lady in customer service listened to what I had to say, took down my employee ID, and told me that this was completely normal. She told me that lots of people reported the colors becoming pictures. It was actually very common to get these sort of calls. She said that if it became anything worrisome, to let them know, but seeing the pictures was completely natural. I hung up, feeling a lot better. I kept feeling better until that night. Until I woke up in the middle of my living room with no earthly idea how I'd gotten there. I had my hand wrapped around the doorknob, and I was fully dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. I was wearing a pair of black boots that I didn't recognize, and I had my car keys in my hand. I'd clearly been going somewhere, but I had no memory of deciding to leave. I'd been getting ready for bed the last I remembered, easing under the covers and just getting snug down for the evening. I remembered falling asleep, though I clearly didn't remember waking back up. I sat up for the rest of the night, a cup of coffee in hand to make sure that I didn't try to slip off and sleepwalk somewhere. I had never had a history of sleepwalking, but I'd heard that people could pick it up later in life. Sleep dressing yourself and sleep driving were something I'd never heard of, but I suppose anything was possible. That day I went out and bought a stopper to put under the door. I bought a flipper lock and installed it myself. I would have put a second deadbolt on as well if I hadn't rented the apartment. I thought if I made it more difficult for myself to leave, I might not sleepwalk outside. If I wanted to blunder around my apartment, that was one thing. Going out with no memory of the outside was another, especially if I'd been intending to drive. I had been taking the pills for about 2 months at this point, but I never equated them to what was going on. I think maybe I just didn't want to. I liked the way they made me feel, and I especially liked the extra money I was getting every month for taking them. Some of the pictures I'd been seeing had come up again. The shoe on the beach had turned out to be a little card from a plane crash over Spain. The Walmart had been celebrating its 20-year anniversary when someone had driven a car through the festivities. I had stopped really looking for them anywhere. I didn't really want to know what they were. I had my own problems to worry about. I'd woken up several times since the first night, standing in different rooms and having no clue how I'd gotten there. I woke up in the kitchen, toast burning in the toaster. I shook awake in the shower, fully clothed as the water fell over me. I came to on the floor of my living room with my legs under the couch, and I awoke several times as I fumbled at the lock on my apartment. Whatever was happening to me, my body seemed to be trying to keep me from hurting myself, and for that I was pretty grateful. I think my body knew the pills were doing something strange to me, but my brain was trying its best to justify the actions. It seemed like my brain might be keeping secrets from the rest of us, secrets that I would find out pretty soon. Then one day, I woke up somewhere different. I woke up as I was standing in a factory, preparing to break a tank full of cloudy liquid with a fire axe. I dropped the axe that I'd been preparing to shatter the glass with and looked around in confusion. Where the hell was I? How had I gotten here? I looked around and could see other people causing general destruction as well, but they didn't seem to have come to like I had. They were destroying lab equipment, factory equipment, and anything else they could get their hands on. They were like a group of mindless ants, swarming over everything they couldn't destroy themselves and wrecking it with sheer numbers. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew I had to get the hell out of there. No one came to stop me as I ran, so I took off and didn't stop running till I was outside. Turned out I was actually somewhere I knew. I'd been inside the Terminus Chemical Building. I'd seen the building many times from the freeway, but I'd never actually been inside it. I had a vague idea of what they did, medical research or chemical trials or something, but I couldn't have told you why I'd been there destroying things. I started moving, making my way for the freeway, and when I got there I managed to thumb a ride and get back to the general vicinity of my apartment. It was the middle of the night when I got out of the building, and the sun was just starting to get up when I got home. For the next 3 days I stayed inside and strapped myself into bed every night. I stopped taking the pills and stopped logging onto the website for my daily training. It appeared that I might have lost my monitor while I was busily destroying the factory, but I was honestly glad to have it off me. My phone rang a few times from unlisted phone numbers, but I never picked them up. I was done taking their drugs and being their guinea pig, if that's all I was. On the 3rd day, someone knocked on the door. After a few minutes of peeking through the peephole, I opened it slowly and glanced mousily through the crack. The monitor was on the front mat, sitting like a bomb on the rough fibers. On top was a note, my name written on the back of a folded Polaroid. I reached for it, not wanting it, but needing to see it. The picture was no grainy Polaroid, but a highly detailed photo of me as I smashed a tank of cloudy liquid with the axe I'd swung that night. On the picture was a little caption that read, "Can you see any colors in this picture? Take your pills, do your training, put on your monitor, and get back to work, lest we send this picture to the police and let them know what you've been up to on your nightly excursions."
Well, Miss Lee, this treatment is experimental, but we feel it will improve your condition. All you need to do is sign on the dotted line, and we can schedule you for the first of the week. The doctor tapped the form like a used car salesman trying to sell a sports car with no engine. The kind of salesman who thinks you're too stupid to look under the hood and too desperate to believe the deal is anything but genuine. That was the beginning of the end of my life. My name is Pandora Lee, and this is my story. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with a debilitating bone disease, the kind that causes your bones to be very weak. My doctor sent me to a specialist, and after running some tests and running up a small fortune in bills, he wanted to try an experimental treatment to harden my bones. I was hesitant. Who wouldn't be? But could I really afford to be in my condition? The following week, I arrived for my first treatment. The waiting room was the same bland area I'd seen 1,000 times. The sort of forgettable facade that hides the work that goes on beyond that unassuming blue door, between the show floor and the butcher's shop. Children moved beads along a wire maze as parents and patients looked through magazines that had been current about 10 years ago. The smiling face of President Obama looked up from a table. He and Martha Stewart sharing space with Better Homes and Gardens and Highlights magazine. The magazines were only slightly more interesting than the paperwork on the clipboard I was muddling through, but I tried my best to ignore them. "Miss Lee, we're ready for you," a young blonde-haired woman in scrubs called to me, smiling brightly as she led me through the oddly dark blue door and into a hallway of the same color. Despite the buzzing overhead lights, the paint scheme made the whole place look shadowy, and I shuddered as she led me to a little room farther down. She showed me to a small, sterile room, with only a gurney and an IV stand to break up the emptiness. The room was blessedly brighter, a kind of eggshell white that verged on eye-watering, and I stepped inside and handed her the clipboard. "Please take a seat and get comfortable, Miss Lee. The doctor will be here very shortly." As I lay there waiting, the clean white paper crinkling under me, I had a gut feeling that this was a bad idea. I chalked it up to nerves, though. It was just another exam, just another series of tests, just another meeting that would end predictably. I should have listened to my gut. As the doctor walked in, he smiled his best Crest Kid smile, and I imagined I could see spit stains on his teeth. I wish I could tell you that he was an ugly little man, some goblin who scared me or made me wish a nurse had stayed to observe our interactions, but he was actually very plain-looking. Thinking back now, I can't tell you anything about him, other than his big grin and his neat little mustache. It might have been easier if he were a monster, but I guess life is rarely easy. "Well, Miss Lee, as you know, this is still experimental. It's in the early trial phases. You'd honestly be one of our first human trials for the treatment, but we feel you are the perfect candidate." I stared at him blankly, unsure whether he expected me to be flattered or break out into applause. He looked uncomfortable, clearly not getting the response he was expecting. Calling the pretty blonde nurse from earlier, he asked her to strap me down and told me to relax. The straps were scratchy, the clasps sitting cold against my arm, and I found it hard not to squirm as she slid the IV in. The doctor reached into the hall and wheeled out a large metal canister. It looked like a fire extinguisher, the old kind with a hand crank, except for the face mask on the end, which is undoubtedly going over my face. He must have noticed my apprehension, because the too big grin made a return appearance. "Don't worry, Miss Lee. It's all very safe." He placed the mask over my face, the smell of cleaner mixing with something sickly sweet and acidic. "Breathe deep," he prompted, and I took my first breath, his voice sounding as if it were coming to me from the lip of a deep hole. "You'll wake up in no time." Then it all went black, my last memory being the stuff I breathed in tasting like the smell of cleaner my mother had always used when I was young. Then I didn't think about anything for a while. I was floating for a while, my body as light as a feather, and I could have gladly floated in that void forever. When I dropped back into my body, however, it was worse than any falling dream I'd ever had. I opened my eyes and looked around frantically, my body still splayed across the gurney as the canister pumped whatever was in the tank into my lungs. I felt a surge of pain rip through my whole body, and I jerked fitfully against the restraints. The scream ripped up my lungs, the gas clouding my mouth as I choked on my anguish. The nurse ran in, trying to calm me to no avail. "Calm down, Miss Lee. We don't want you to damage your bones while the treatment is doing its job. The pain is only temporary. The doctor will be in to give you something for it and explain everything." Her words did nothing for the pain that drilled into my bones, and after what seemed like hours, the doctor finally came in. He had a needle in his hand. The tip slid easily into the IV, and he filled the saline bag with something. It was cold, the liquid flowing in like ice, but the relief was immediate. I lay back gasping, the sudden lack of pain almost as jarring as the pain had been, and the big smile hovered over me like a specter. The first treatment is always the most painful, but it seems to be a success so far. You might have some joint stiffness for a few days, but that's to be expected, as the treatment hardens your bones. As the gas hissed and the ice brought sweet relief to my inflamed bones, I lay there drinking in grateful lungs of air. The lack of pain was hard to quantify, but I became aware over time that it wasn't just the sudden burning that had gone away. The everyday pain I had gotten used to, the inflamed joints and the deep ache of weakened bones, was also gone. It was like someone had flipped a switch in me, and suddenly I was exactly like I'd been before. This may seem like a small thing, but when you've lived with the pain, made it a day-to-day part of your life, its absence is like a physical loss. It was like a kid who's had his tooth pulled, his tongue prodding at the vacancy where something solid had been before. When he spoke, I had to shake myself back to reality to ask him to repeat himself. "We will see you in 2 weeks for your next treatment. The nurse will give you a prescription when you leave. Take it twice a day in order to keep your body from rejecting the treatment. Understand?" I nodded, still a little dazed, and agreed to take the pills. I made another appointment with the similarly pretty brunette and took the nondescript little bag she handed me. She smiled, saying they would see me in 2 weeks, and I headed home. As I drove home, I expected the pain to rear its head again with every press of a pedal or turn of the wheel. The pain had become like a swarm of gnats, ever present and buzzing. You never got used to it, but you became accustomed to it. It's never comfortable, but you look forward to the times when it isn't there. Now, it was just gone. I was driving with nary a pain or a wince, something I hadn't done in years. I should have been happy, but I kept waiting for it to disappear. Maybe that made me a pessimist, but I don't care. When you live like this long enough, you constantly wait for the other shoe to drop. I walked into my house, my bones still feeling like nothing so much as normal bones, and took the pills out of the bag. Reading over the label for side effects or warnings, I found nothing but the instructions on the outside. No name, no ingredients, no warnings, just 8 words in bold font. Take 1 pill, with food, twice a day. I opened the bottle and let a few of the pills roll onto my palm. They were white and blue gel capsules, the contents looking like nothing so much as the sugar on top of the snow caps my husband ate at the movies. As they sat in my hand, I noticed that they were oddly cold to the touch, and the feeling reminded me of the way the liquid had felt as it entered my IV. When they didn't immediately appear dangerous or try to bite me, I let them tumble back into the bottle and closed the lid. I set a reminder on my phone for 7 a.m. and started fixing dinner. When I went to bed that night, I had already forgotten about them, but as I pulled the blankets up around myself, I felt a sudden chill arrow through me. It should have raised a sort of red flag, but I was still riding the high of moving about my home without any of the pain from earlier that day. A few hours later, though, I was awoken by an icy chill going through my body, followed by an intense ache in my joints. As I tried to get up, I felt every bone in my body tighten. It was almost impossible to walk, but after a few minutes, it eased up, and I was able to make it to the bathroom. I figured this was just a side effect of the stiffness the doctor was talking about. And after a warm bath, some of the pain had abated. With some of my mobility returned, I shuffled back to bed, hoping to sleep off the pain until it was time for my first dose of medication. The next day, the pain of the night before was a fleeting memory, and I took my first pill and started getting ready for my day. It usually took me several hours to get my legs to cooperate enough to make breakfast, but today I moved about my kitchen the way I hadn't in years. My joints felt fluid, my bones were as forgettable as they should be, and when I woke my husband up for work at 10, he looked at me a little shocked to find breakfast already on the table, and the kitchen dishes cleaned and put away. "Wow, those treatments really did the trick," he said, taking my hands in his big calloused ones, intent on kissing them. He dropped them in surprise as a shudder ran through him, "Geez, babe, your hands are so cold." There was worry on his face, but I waved his worries away and told him it was nothing. "It's just a side effect of the treatment. I'm fine, sweetie." Deep down, though, I was worried. I should have called the doctor's office right then and there and told them about the side effects. After the weirdness that had happened the night before, I should have been more concerned. But it all comes back to one thing. Despite the stiffness, despite the cold hands, despite the next 2 weeks where sometimes I woke up in the middle of the night and hobbled into a warm bath, the intense pain in my bones was all but a distant memory. I would have given anything to be done with the pain like that, and it turned out the cost was more than I could have known. 2 weeks later, I arrived at my next appointment. I was curious to see if it hurt the same way it had the time before, but my reasons for going were twofold. I had taken the last of my pills that morning, and I knew that I would need more if I wanted to maintain this lack of joint pain. So I smiled at the nurse, let them strap me down again, let them slide the needle into my arm, and breathed in the gas like the good doctor told me to. The treatment was performed the same as the first, but I gritted my teeth through the pain as I waited for him to inject my IV with that sweet icy liquid as the gas did its work. As the straps slid off, I nodded through the closing instructions and shuffled up to the desk to make my appointment and get my pills. I moved as if in a dream, my body feeling strangely heavy as I climbed into my car and drove home. I jerked awake in my driveway, unsure how I had arrived home. I had never fallen asleep at the wheel, much less sleep drove home, and the thought made me shiver. I grabbed my prescription and headed inside, wanting to get as far from the vehicle as possible at that moment. I thought about starting dinner as I trudged in, but decided to take a nap instead. It was early still, only mid-afternoon, but I was suddenly exhausted. I could barely keep my eyes open, and as I slid into bed, wearing the same clothes I'd left the house in, I thought I was settling in for nothing but a couple hours of rest. 10 hours later, I shuddered awake into total darkness as an Arctic chill shot through my nerve endings. It was worse than it had ever been, worse than any time before it, and as I tried to climb out of bed, my legs froze up and sent me spilling to the floor. I lay there, unable to bend my legs or arms, only able to pull them towards me like palsied claws. I was overjoyed when I heard my husband's soft snores from the bed beside me. He would help me. He would get me to the hospital. He could get me into a warm bath, and I opened my mouth to scream his name. My lips trembled as I prepared to cry out for him, but no sound escaped my chilly maw. I gasped weakly, his name lost amongst the short barks of sound, while he slept peacefully a few feet away. I lay there with tears of fear dripping down my face, certain that he would wake up the next morning to find me dead. I almost expected to see them freeze against my cheeks, but they did little more than pool beneath my head and wet the side of my face. I spent that night drifting in and out of my new painful existence. It felt like I lay there for weeks, listening to the content snores of my spouse as my body was racked with freezing chills. I thought I would die again and again, and as the sun began to rise, I almost wished for it. The colder I became, the less the shivers seemed to blow through me. I still felt them, but my body had stopped responding. I was powerless to move, incapable of doing much besides watching the sunrise and the day begin. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because when my husband yelled my name, my eyes were startled open. What the hell is this?" But he seemed to lose his words as he stood over me. I mouthed at him, asking him to help me, but he looked unsure. I don't know how. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but instead he turned to my vanity and fetched a small hand mirror. I looked back at myself, not sure it was me for a moment. I was looking at a perfect china doll as she lay curled up on the floor. Her skin was a perfect alabaster, broken only by the slight spider cracks that ran through it. As I watched, another chill coursed through me, and I saw the cracks lengthen as my fragile form tried to shiver. I wanted to cry, but I had no tears left. Instead, I told him to put the phone next to me and put it on text-to-speech. I wanted him to understand, wanted to explain how this had happened, while I could still explain anything. He did as I asked, saying he would go get help, but I don't think he'll be back in time. It took a surprisingly short time to lay it all out, but I can feel the change beginning to affect my face now. My blinks are becoming slower and slower, and my throat's beginning to tighten as it stiffens like my skin. My lips have started to flake as I speak, the cracks in my arms likely running through the lips my husband loved to kiss. I'll be nothing but a beautiful statue soon, a curiosity piece for people to speculate over. But with the time I have left, I want people to understand how I came to this point. I don't know if it was the treatment or the pills, maybe it was both, but it doesn't appear to be ready for human trials. If they ask you to sign your life away as I did, make sure you know what you're agreeing to. The short respite from pain wasn't worth the hell I found myself in now. It's getting hard to breathe now. My lungs are laboring to pull in breath, and I can feel the same shivering running through them with every gasping pull. My eyes are fixed forward, my fingers forever locked together, and I feel that every word may be my last. If you make it home, Jason, know that I love you, and I'm sorry that this is where we must part.
You'll have to bear with me while I tell you my story. So much of it is written from the hazy recollections of someone who was in captivity.
Don't misunderstand. I wasn't abused in the traditional sense. I was well kept, I was well fed, and I really wanted for nothing, except my freedom. It all started one day when I visited a new therapist. Dr. McAllister had been recommended by a friend of mine. He said he was very good, and he'd helped him get through a lot of issues that he had with his mother and discover some things about his sexuality. He put you under and put you in touch with your real self, and that was how he overcame a lot of your issues. It all sounded great to me. I'd been having trouble sleeping and was looking for some way to get the sleep I needed to function. My insomnia would sometimes last for days, and it was starting to affect my life. So, I made an appointment, and 2 weeks later I was lying on his couch, listening to Dr. McAllister count down from 10 as he put me in a suggestive trance. It was very sudden, like blinking, but everything changed after that trance. When I came out just as suddenly, Dr. McAllister looked strange, and I asked if something had happened. Strange may not be descriptive enough. He looked somehow enraptured, enlightened, utterly worshipful. You spoke to me about things you couldn't possibly have known. You talked to me about my childhood. You helped me get over the death of my mother. You helped me more in this hour-long session than I've ever helped anyone. I wasn't sure what he was talking about, but when he gripped my hand, his eyes shone like the lights of a zealot. I need more. Please let me put you back under, so I can discover more. I pulled away from him and took a huge step back. What the hell was he talking about? I had come here for help, but suddenly he wanted me to help him. I had to get out of here. I had to leave now. McAllister tried to stop me, but I was out the door before he could say much more than stop. I didn't sleep well that night either. It was becoming a real problem. Sometimes I would lay in bed and swear I heard whispers, but I put it off as auditory hallucinations. I hadn't slept well in the past 3 weeks, and I knew it was something that would catch up to me eventually. When I would force myself out of the house for work or to run errands, I could swear I felt someone watching me. What's more, I could swear I'd catch glimpses of someone from the corner of my eye, but they would always be gone when I turned to look at them. It never happened in my house, always when I was out and about, and the paranoia on top of the sleep deprivation was slowly eroding my sanity. So, when I heard someone open a window in my living room one night, I rolled over and just thought it was me having paranoid hallucinations. Turned out, it hadn't been a hallucination. When I heard someone open my bedroom door, I rolled over and found Dr. McAllister standing there watching me. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well either, and his eyes looked crazed as we stood staring at each other. I wasn't sure if he was real or not, but when he lunged at me, I curled into a ball and cried out for him to stop. He didn't attack me, though. He didn't hurt me at all, though now I wish he'd killed me right there. Instead, he just slipped a needle into my arm, and I watched his thumb push down the plunger as I felt a wave of warm and inviting sleep roll through me. I woke up in a finished basement, the lights turned down low, strapped to a chair as Dr. McAllister made sure my bindings were comfortable. I struggled, my limbs heavy and uncoordinated, but he held up a fresh needle and told me if I didn't calm down, he was going to put me out again. I made myself as still as I could, not sure what to expect here. This didn't seem to be a sexual thing. I was fully dressed, and the way he was tending to me almost felt worshipful. I didn't want it to come to this, but I can't live without the knowledge you possess. I know you don't believe what I'm saying, but while you were unconscious, you told me about things that may very well change my life. You spoke to me of things that opened my eyes, ideas I had never even conceived of, and the longer I went without hearing your voice again, the more I felt my newfound security crumbling. I'm sorry, I'm not usually like this, but I had to possess you, to have your knowledge, to understand your words. I can promise you that while you remain with me, you'll want for nothing. You are to me as a captured god that I wish to understand. We talked a lot that night, though I mostly yelled at him to let me go. In the end, though, he just injected me with something to knock me out, and I drifted off into a peaceful unconsciousness. And that was how I became Dr. McAllister's captive god. I will say that while I was with him, I never wanted for restful sleep. This was due in part to the fact that I spent most of my time in a near catatonic state. Dr. McAllister kept me restrained in a large underground area that I always thought of as the basement. I was seated in a large, comfortable chair, my hands secured to the arms with soft straps. There was a remote at hand, and I was allowed to watch anything I wanted on television, as long as the doctor was away. If I was hungry, all I had to do was push a button, and a short blonde woman, who I would later discover was the doctor's wife, would bring me anything I wanted. In the beginning, it really wasn't so bad. I was kept in a sluggish state from the drugs he used on me to induce the state that he wanted, but it wasn't bad. I watched TV, I ate, I existed. Given that I had worked 40-plus hours a week and lived off crappy food for most of my adult life, I felt almost like I was being pampered. I was free to relax. I could do almost anything, except leave or talk to people who were likely to wonder what had happened to me. My mom, my dad, my friends, I wondered if any of them wondered what had happened to me. It may seem odd to you that I never tried to escape, but my head was always in a cloud of some sort. The drugs left me just lucid enough to consume TV or audiobooks, but I never felt able to really settle my thoughts on anything in particular. I knew I should want to escape, but it was always a hard concept to catch hold of. Those days were the good days, back when Dr. McAllister was still operating his practice. That was when he was still pretending to have a normal life. He would come down in the evenings to talk with me, just telling me his problems and asking me to help. He would ask me about stocks or bonds, the housing market, business ideas, patents, inventions, and I would try my best to direct him in the way he wanted. I wasn't really sure what he wanted. My head was too foggy most of the time to make sense of it, but I would try my best to help him without the need to be placed in an unconscious state. We'd talk for hours about everything from the state of his marriage, the depraved childhood he had lived through, the future of psychology, and even the condition of his soul. I didn't always want to hear what he had to say, but I understood that it didn't really matter what I wanted. It didn't seem to make much of a difference anyway. We would talk for hours, but the end result was always a needle in my arm or my neck and several hours of blissful unconsciousness. I remember little from these periods of blackout, fortunately, but sometimes I would go to a dark place and just hang suspended in the murk. Things would whisper to me there, tell me things I couldn't understand. I was powerless to stop them. This happened very rarely, but it was still too often for my tastes. I don't know what I said to Dr. McAllister in those times, but there was always a drastic change when I came back to myself. It wasn't always for the better either. Once I came back to myself and felt something wet in my lap. I glanced down, which was difficult because my head was strapped to the headrest, and found that someone had thrown a head into my lap. I flinched away from it as my groggy brain finally clicked it all together, but it was little more than a shudder in my current state. The head had wispy gray hair, a pair of broken glasses hanging across the face from one ear, and a nose full of broken veins from a lifetime of drinking. I didn't recognize it, but as it soaked the pants of my pajamas, I did feel like it was familiar somehow. Dr. McAllister was sitting across from me, looking expectantly at the gift he had literally dropped in my lap, and I looked at it with confusion as I asked why he had done this. You told me to. You said if I meant to truly get over the cruelty and abuse that my father had given me, then I had to destroy the icon of my father within myself. So I did. I told him that I wanted to meet so we could discuss our past and reconcile. He was ecstatic. He hadn't seen me in 20 years, and oh, did we reconcile. I waited for him to turn around, and I bashed his head in with a hammer, choking him to death as he lay twitching on the floor. Then I took the body and disposed of it, cutting the head off so I could show you that I'd followed your instructions. You're so wise, so correct. I am your loyal disciple, always. I started screaming, mindless, gibbering noise, but he just bowed to me, and when the head hit the ground next to him, he didn't even flinch. That was my first inclination that the things I was saying in my sleep might be used in this way, in ways that I had never considered. After that, he started bringing people down to see me. At first, it was his wife, the blonde woman who'd been feeding me. She looked skeptical as she approached, content to keep her husband's secrets, but unsure of joining him in this new experiment. I knew from our talks that he was afraid she would leave him, but enjoyed the financial stability of their marriage. He stuck me with the needle as she sat a few feet away, and when I came to, she was bowing and crying and thanking me for helping her see the truth. My husband was right. You are truly a god. I was wrong to ever doubt you, or him. After that, it was friends and colleagues. They all seemed confused when he introduced them to me, calling me his god of knowledge, and some of them laughed, thinking it was a joke. They would sit and talk to me, listening to my answers, and looking at McAllister as if to ask if this were an elaborate prank. In the end, though, when I came back from the little nap he would subject me to, it was always the same. Their smirks of disbelief or scowls of confusion were replaced with rapturous awe, and they would pledge their undying fealty to me. No matter how many of them I begged to release me, the outcome was always the same. A religion of sorts began to form. Over time, McAllister drew in his cult. It was only a few at first, 5, 10, but it quickly grew into a sizable little flock. The followers began to take care of me, washing and feeding and seeing to my every whim, except the most important. I would ask them to release me, beg them to let me go, but it was always interpreted as a test of some sort. Their God was testing them to see if they were loyal to the here or to the hereafter, and they would thank me for helping them fortify their belief in me as they slid my hands back into the restraints or pushed my head back into the buckles. I yelled at them. I called them idiots. I tried to push them, but the constant use of sedatives and the lack of any regular exercise had made me weak. I wasn't wasting away, but I wasn't getting the exercise I needed to be certain. I could do little to free myself. My bonds always replaced, and after a while I just gave in. The funny thing was that whatever I was telling them while I was under was working. McAllister showed me the money he had made, earned from the stock market and selling property, and the cult began to thrive. What's more, they all claimed to have cast off whatever addictions or mental health problems or childhood traumas had plagued them, and they were addicted now to nothing but serving me. Like McAllister had said, those who tried to leave or to return to their lives reported feeling hopeless and manic unless they could return to my presence and hear my words, whatever they were. That's when things started to get bad. McAllister was truly addicted to my influence, and it led him to overstep. McAllister had been gathering his followers at his home, and while it was large, it was becoming too small to hold all of them. I can't really speculate how many there were, but the basement was standing room only. I sat beneath a small bar that he was standing on, and the sea of bodies was dizzying. Though he was speaking, they all looked at me as if I were speaking through him. So many eyes looking at me. My body still held in the chair I had sat in for God knew how long was something I never quite got used to. It never made me feel like a deity. It never made me feel powerful to have them worship me. It always made me feel like a pet, my freedom just one open door away. McAllister said they'd be moving to a new place soon, a place that would house them all comfortably. They could all stay there indefinitely, leaving their jobs and lives behind so they could care for their captive God. He didn't say where it was, but he said they would all go this afternoon and prepare for a long journey. They were all so happy, their faces enraptured as he told them about their new home. But I began to feel that this would never end. When he began to bring people to see me, I had hoped that someone would fail to see me as he did and get me out of here. They would take me away from him. They would call the police, and I would be saved from my captivity. That never happened. Whatever power I had held them in sway, and after a while I doubted that I would ever get out of here. I didn't know how long I had been McAllister's captive God, but I knew that no matter how comfortable the life, this had to end. I decided then that if they weren't going to get me out, I would have to do it myself. Strangely, my chance came that very day. They had all left me so they could prepare, and as I sat in the shadowy basement, I realized that my wrist strap was undone. This had never happened before. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. It took all the energy I had to focus enough to get my hand to undo the other strap. And when I bent down to undo my legs, the effort seemed to take years. My mind was like unraveling yarn, and it was hard to focus on any particular task. When the bonds came off my legs, I got shakily to my feet before bending to rub some life into them. They were prickly from the lack of use, and I took shaky steps as I made for the stairs. I got to the top before I was discovered. I peeked through the door and into the barren kitchen beyond. The cupboards were empty, the countertops clean, and I could tell that this room had already been cleaned out for the move. I had just decided to take a step out and make for the back door when someone walked into the kitchen and saw me. They called for McAllister, walking to me as they insisted I return to my chair. I pushed at them, telling them to get away from me, to get out of my way, but as I lunged for the back door, I heard others coming in to stop me. I made it to the backyard, squinting at the sun as it hit my eyes, but I found it fenced with tall wooden boards. I was grabbed by many hands, and when someone slipped a needle into my neck, I looked back to see McAllister instruct them to get me in the car. I came to some time later, and I was laying in an elaborate bed, my hands cuffed to the frame. That began the worst part of my confinement, though it was thankfully the end of it. After that, the drugging became worse. McAllister and his inner circle kept me in a near constant catatonic state. The drugs he used were no longer just injected, and they began to experiment with other substances. The documents that were found later said they received different outcomes when different kinds of drugs were used, and they often sat around and drank or laughed as I came in and out of reality. I was aware of nothing in those times. A ship drifting on a sea of time. I could have been with them for days. I could have spent decades under their control. But to me, time was only islands glimpsed from afar. I didn't see many people in that time, just the 5 or so who were in McAllister's inner circle. But these men always spoke as if they were doing very well. Often there was cigar smoke around my bed, the smell of expensive liquor, and always the low murmur of talk as they waited for me to tell them what else they might do to gain more power. I'd become their oracle, their captive god as opposed to their revered deity, and they threatened to use me up. These are the times I remember the least about, except for the end. I spent a lot of my days in a black stupor, and the more they experimented, the more often I was back in the dark place. When I came back from these trances, I noticed a change in my captors. Gone were the shining eyes of the enraptured. Disappeared were the weeping orbs of the enlightened. They were replaced by the flinty eyes of the zealot, and I was afraid that he might break his promise. He looked angry, but also resolved. Whatever I had told him weighed heavily on him, but I wouldn't understand the burden, not for a while yet. Not until the day it all came to an end. I came to one afternoon to find an intrusive light leaking into my dark chamber. They had always kept me in this persistent dark room, but now the door was open, and something was laying in it. On the floor, there were others, none of them moving, and I was confused by their sudden stillness. Was this something new? Were they sleeping, or were they... I tried to put that thought out of my head. They couldn't be dead, I reminded myself as I shook my chains. If they were all dead, then who would free me so I didn't die here too? I did as you said, came a monotone voice, and I jumped as I realized that one of the slumped forms had only been praying. It was McAllister. He looked wild. His salt and pepper hair was sticking up at odd angles, and his face was splattered with blood. His shirt was soaked in something as it hung on him like a wet sack. He appeared to be praying, but as something clinked in his shaky hands, I saw that he held a gun. I was afraid that he would shoot me too for half a second, but as he put it under his chin, I became even more afraid that he would use it on himself. I have risen as high as I can. Your will dictates that I must shed my vehicle to rise any higher. I shall see you on the other side. His blood made a crimson line across my face as the gun went off. And suddenly, my fears were realized. I was alone. Luckily for me, someone heard the gunshot. I would lay in that bed for 2 days before the FBI came to investigate the compound. Turned out they'd been keeping an eye on McAllister for quite some time, ever since he had started gathering followers at his home. After 2 years in his new compound, they had begun to try to prepare a case against him, before he woke up one morning and decided to put an end to his little flock. With the help of his wife, they had poisoned the morning meal, and McAllister had drawn his inner circle to a meeting before breakfast. That's where he shot them, as they sat listening to my latest ramblings. They had found journals that claimed there were things I had told them, but after interviewing me, I think they decided that he was out of his mind. At least, that's what Agent Maxit led me to believe. We're going to have to hold you as a person of interest, but it honestly sounds like you were an unwilling participant. I'm going to go and get some things in order. Have a seat. We'll make some accommodations for you. After he left, I noticed the recorder sitting on the table. It wasn't running, which I had expected, and when I reached for it, I saw the tape inside had a date on it that I remembered. It was the date of my first session with Dr. McAllister. Couldn't imagine a reason behind the FBI having a tape with that date on it, unless McAllister had recorded it for some reason. I put the recorder back down, trying to stop my curiosity before it could take root. I had never heard what I sounded like in that state that seemed to enrapture the old doctor so much. What had I said to him to make him throw his whole life away in the pursuit of it? I couldn't help myself. I hit play on the recorder and listened as McAllister told me to be calm and began to count down from 10. It wasn't the jagged, often flighty voice I remembered from any time after his session. This was McAllister at his most sane, and as he came to 1, I heard him gasp and ask what I was doing. From the recording, I heard a slightly deeper version of my own voice, and it filled me with dread. Agent Maxit has been listening to the tapes. He's becoming as unstable as the good doctor. If you don't escape now, I fear that he'll have you just like McAllister did. You'll have to be quick, and you'll have to be smart. But if you mean to be free, you need to find a way out of here. Good luck.
It was an accident. It could have happened to anyone, which makes me wonder why it had to happen to me. I've worked construction for years. I've never so much as gotten a deep cut or broke a bone. Bruises sometimes, minor cuts. Nothing that stopped me from coming in the next day, though. It was just a typical day, really. I was performing an inspection, chatting with a buddy on a side job, and listening to the sound of an active construction site as it thrummed around me. Insurance would try to prove that I hadn't been wearing my safety gear, but I had witnesses that could attest that I'd been wearing my goggles, my hard hat, and my OSHA-approved gear when it happened. The drug test they had submitted me to showed I had nothing stronger in my system than the bagel I'd had for breakfast. It wasn't the fault of anyone besides whoever attached the rebar to that girder, I suppose. Even then, it wasn't really the welder's fault. It had simply come loose and stood there, waiting for me to get careless. On that day, I turned suddenly as I was inspecting an area of the basement, when a jutting piece of rebar, which I had made note of 1,000 times, pierced my safety goggles and stabbed right into my left eye. The members of my crew found me on the floor of the basement as I started to scream. The piece of rebar had gone through my goggles due to a slight fracture in the lens. That, plus my forward momentum, had caused the lens to break and my eye to be punctured. The rebar, as it happens, had been covered in dust. The dust caused the cut to become infected with a virulent strain of bacteria and ultimately required the removal of my eye. I tell you all this to explain how I came to be in a hospital bed, minus an eye, and strapped to the bed as soon as I finish writing this, since they fear I might be a danger to myself. But that's getting a little ahead of the story, I guess. It started the first night after I lost my eye. I'd been rushed to the ER right away, and the prognosis had been bad almost at once. There was definitely damage. There was the virulent strain of bacteria in the wound that was reacting badly. It was decided that it would be best if the eye was removed immediately to save the rest of my face. They were keeping me overnight to monitor the wound, make sure they got all the bacteria out, make sure the wound was healing properly as well. I remember laying there before I drifted off, trying to come to terms with my new vision and wondering how different my life would be with only one eye. When I drifted off, I was suddenly greeted by something terrible. I was looking through a single eye, staring up at a red, unbroken sky the color of old flames. Long runners of fire, falling stars they looked like, were cascading down, and I could hear a thundering as my point of view shook with the near constant vibration. I was low, making me think I was less than an inch tall, and though I could look around, I couldn't move. Things were moving around me, though, creatures of perverted geometry. They lumbered about as though every step pained them greatly. As I watched them, something long and spidery, like a needle with wings, descended on me, its long proboscis growing as it landed astride my point of view. As the needle came down towards me, I woke up screaming. The nurses tried to calm me down, telling me I had just had a nightmare, and I tried to drift back off to sleep, visions of that smoldering place still in my head. The next time I closed my eyes, I was staring up at that crimson sky again. The fire was still raining down, but now I was staring at an absolute horror of a creature as it cocked its head in a nearly feline curiosity. It looked almost skeletal, like a Halloween decoration that moved a little too well. As I watched it, it scuttled a little closer, stalking my point of view. Its eye sockets were bare, I thought, but the closer it got, the better I could see a pair of bright yellow pinpricks in the depths of those cavernous sockets. Its ink-black tongue would flick out every now and again, so it could moisten its seemingly bony lips. It was skulking in on 6 strangely jointed legs, and it reminded me of Toothless from the How to Train Your Dragon movies. Well, Toothless's skeleton, at least. It cocked its head as it towered over me, but when it opened its mouth, I felt another scream break through my sleeping lips. Its mouth was like a garbage disposal full of teeth, 2 sets spinning in a circular buzzsaw pattern as it hissed and screamed at me. The screams could have broken glass, and my ears actually started bleeding as it screeched over me. The head snapped down, strange teeth covering my point of view, and I woke up to 2 orderlies restraining me. That's when someone stuck a needle in my neck, and I was left in a mercifully dreamless sleep. But dreams, it seems, were the least of my worries that night. I was treated to that same sky, that same damn amber sky, until the drugs wore off. In that time, I saw those lumbering giants make their way across the blasted land. I saw human beings, too, as they made their way across the blasted land, some of them trampled by the lumbering behemoths, or hunted and maimed by those skeletal horrors. Little burnt tan creatures, almost like frogs that had learned how to walk, capered about, shoving and kicking at the naked, stumbling humans that walked about confusedly. Their skin was seared, their bodies bleeding, but no matter what happened to them, they just kept screaming and writhing in endless pain. The vision went on, an endless hell that I was forced to watch as the world on the other side moved on. I don't know if it was heaven or hell, but the only thing that remained the same was the crimson sky and the burning rain. The rest of that day, I was kept in a medical-induced state, living in that hell and seeing its atrocities. In that time, it felt as though I slept for years. Time had no meaning in that place, and the lumbering beasts became a sort of rude clock for me. They would lumber by periodically, and I would mark that as an hour. Their footsteps would shake the ground, making my peripheral shudder, and my vision felt like ripples on a pond. Of the strange skeletal creatures, there was very little to see after the first one. None of them approached me again. The mosquito creatures kept their distance as well. I suppose they hadn't found me particularly tasty, so they were content to leave me alone. That was until one of the little brown creatures came to investigate. I'd been staring at that amber sky for 2 passes of the lumbering beasts when a face that only a mother could love swam up out of the void. It was so sudden that I yelped internally, not really sure what to do now that something living had come close again. Nothing had come to bother me for so long that I had begun to think my position was going to remain this dull little space until I eventually came out of this state. The ugly, lumpy creature bent down, bringing its face very close to my position, before wrapping a hand around me and bathing me in far too welcoming darkness. Light peeked through the fingers as we ran, but that seemed to be the point where the drugs were beginning to wear off, and I started to come out. I squinted my remaining eye at the heavy rays of the afternoon sun, and felt my stomach rumble at the tray that set before me. When the nurse came in, smiling, as she watched me eat, I asked her how long I had been out for. I expected it to be a week, maybe a month, but she told me it had been about 12 hours. It felt as though I had spent years in that terrible place, counted out days' worth of hours by the passing of the creatures, and I felt that I never wanted to go back there again. I wasn't sure if it was the act of sleeping or just the act of closing my eyes, but I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself from sleep. That wasn't particularly hard. I had been asleep for 12 straight hours. But as the night wound on, that feeling of heavy eyelids became harder and harder to ignore. The TV shows became a little less stimulating, the bed became a little more comfortable, and my head began to dip and slide towards my chest. They wouldn't let me have any coffee for some reason, no stimulants at all, and the water was cutting it not at all. I made it till just after sunrise, somehow, but as I slipped into unconsciousness, I was greeted with something worse than I could have ever imagined. As I slipped off, I was treated to the worst vision yet. I was sitting high up now, in a throne room straight from the mind of Wes Craven. When they speak of otherworldly geometry and Lovecraft, I have to believe they've seen this place. Nothing was equal, nothing congruent. The angles hurt to look at. The edges were like razor blades, and the building was either made by a madman or someone who was driven mad by its construction. When you read this, you won't understand, but I ask you to try. The room looked like it was designed to inspire anxiety, foster nightmares, put the inhabitants on edge until madness swallowed them whole. The whole room was a dirty white. It wasn't off-white. It wasn't a dark white. It was a filthy white. I had seen the way windows look when they're caked with mud, and that was this color. It made my skin crawl, or it would have if I'd had any skin at that moment. The color was throughout. The feeling it gave me, coupled with the anxiety from the construction I was now inside of, made me want to shudder and vomit at the same time. It was filled with pews, which were piled with the muddy frog creatures I'd seen before. They were all manner of sizes, their lumpy bodies pressed into those seats as they sat there in rapture of me, it seemed. They were dressed strangely in garments I can only describe as fancy rags, and as I watched, the show began. A line of naked, screaming people were dragged forward, unclothed brown creatures prodding them with sticks as they looked at me in horror. These people were in terrible shape. The best among them were bruised and dirty, but some of them were lucky to be standing. I could see bodies burned down to the white meat, bones poking from them, eyes and limbs missing. But the most horrifying part was how these injuries didn't seem to bother them. They were filthy and afraid, but I got the feeling that their injuries were secondary in their mind. As the first one was pushed towards me, the brown creature opened its mouth and spoke with a voice like a well filled with water. "We have rounded up these cattle for punishment, my lord." I was confused as the dark-haired man who was roughly my age stumbled forward, but I wouldn't have long to revel in that lack of knowledge. "Who dares to trespass within my realm?" I heard it and turned, though I had no body. I was held aloft on a pedestal, and the creature beside me seemed to be my captor. It was beyond all earthly description, but I will try. Imagine one of those Jim Henson Skeksis had all the skin burned off of it, down to the bone, and then had the flesh reapplied badly with red and brown Play-Doh. Its eyes were piss-yellow slits, its jaws were beak-like and sharp-looking, and its flesh appeared to be oozing as it spoke in a thick, deep voice like a frog at the bottom of a ravine. It spoke to the brown creatures, telling them how they wanted the people tortured, and then, suddenly, it noticed me. Turning its head, it smiled as it saw me looking at it, and its pleasure was even worse than its anger somehow. "See what awaits you, human. Witness and despair." It croakingly hissed out these words at me. I came awake, screaming again, and thankfully, they didn't put me under this time. I've been in the restraints for 4 days now. They transferred me to a psychiatric ward, and the straps were to stop me from digging at my skin. I've been awake for 4 days, refusing to go to sleep because every time I nod off, I'm returned to that hateful place. I gaze upon that creature as he passes judgment, never sleeping, never leaving, and I wake up screaming. I've begged my doctors not to sedate me, but I think they will before long. I'm writing this under heavy supervision, trying to explain to my doctors since words seem to have failed me. I'm hoping he understands that, despite my state, I don't want to hurt myself. I've seen what lies beyond, and it's not something I'm in any hurry to get to. "Have a seat," they offer, that unyielding, uncaring beast of torture who beckons sweetly to seat you at the mouth of hell. You've been here before. How could you have forgotten? Your mind remembers that last torturous exchange at the hands of the Eye. Has it been that long already? It seems like only yesterday that you sat before the device and were made quivering, supplicant before its undeniable power. You beg with them, you plead with them, you offer them excuses that ring more and more hollow than the ones before. They smile that implacable smile and tell you that it's all part of the procedure and that you must have a seat. Then you're down at eye level with a device of unimaginable horror. You stare unblinking into the eye of some dark, elder god that loves you not. The device, the torturous abomination of man, stares back at you with its soulless eye full of nothing but dark knowledge and your pain. As you sit staring into it, you find your hatred of it lost amidst the dark miasma of nothingness within it, its implacable gaze fixed upon you, and then the waiting begins. The waiting. The waiting is the worst. As the cruel operator of pain takes their place, you stare into the eye and wonder when the blow will come. The eye of this great terror hangs before you, staring, staring, staring. You know in your heart that it is just as unmovable as the one who wakes it. They think they understand it, understand the power it represents. But could either of you truly understand this thing? If God appeared before us in the sky, splitting it asunder, and some towering eye looked down through the tear, could any of us really understand it? Our thoughts and prayers and feelings and terror are as insignificant as white noise before the eye of this nightmare creature that sits a mere nose length from your own precious eye. Oh God, it's moving. As it moves and slides and takes its position, you suddenly wish for the waiting again. The waiting was worse, but the waiting was safe. And now this monstrosity is alive. It takes its time and gets into position, its movements more graceful than any hunting cat. It stalks your tender orb. What does it want? Why doesn't it just get it over with? You're powerless before it. Even if you could rise, you wouldn't, as it takes its time and finds the most delicate part of your treasured eye. You wait and hunch and hope you're ready for its strike. A single dry puff into your already exposed eye, and you jump and writhe with fright and imagined pain. Then you laugh. Of course you laugh, because it's just an insignificant puff of air. You hardly notice the other eye, as a similar breath of the beast's fell air assaults it, and the mistress of pain and anguish declares you done. She invites you to rise, and you move away from the machine that could never really hurt you. It could never threaten you. You forget your fear. You forget your terror. But how well we remember when it comes time to stand before the eye again.